Thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here. This is the second time, and I am therefore doubly honored. I want to thank TASC for inviting me and for organizing this extremely important conference at an extremely difficult time. Yesterday's events were quite tragic. Britain lost someone who had been a great progressive. Second in a year, less than a year ago, my friend Michael Meacher died after a long and distinguished career standing up for the types of principles that have been mentioned here. And now someone whose contribution to that struggle for justice has been cut sadly short. As I arrived last evening, and I stood briefly in line to have my passport inspected, I said to myself, is this the last time I will stand in a line that says EU only? We don't know what's going to happen next Thursday in Britain. I was at an event night before last called the Progressive Case for the European Union, where two of the speakers were one of our outstanding MPs, Keir Starmer, who happens actually to be my MP in London, and a radical trade unionist, Matt Rack of the Fire Brigade Union, and they were both defending why we should remain in the European Union. I was one of the speakers, as were several other economists in support of the European Union. There is an important underlying question here. Why is it necessary to have an event called the Progressive Case for the European Union? Why couldn't we just say the case for the European Union? The reason is that the economic policies of the European Union have been converted into one of the most draconian, backward, troglodyte versions of economics of any government in the world. I can come back to that. But first, the purpose of my speech is to explain the economics underlying principles which, in an earlier era, when I took economics in the 1960s, principles which would have been considered absolutely ludicrous. They would have been considered the economics of the illiterate. The idea that deficits in themselves are a problem. I can remember the chairman of Lyndon Johnson's economic advisors, his chairman of the economic advisors named Gardner Ackley in the second half of the 1960s. He was from the university I attended, University of Michigan. And he came back and spoke while I was there. And in an answer to a question about deficits, he said, the big mistake of everyone worried about deficits is they think the purpose of taxation is to fund expenditure. And well, that's right, it is sort of. That, everyone thinks that now. And it's wrong. That is not why governments, that is not why they should tax. The purpose of taxation is not to pay for expenditure. And I will come back to that, as strange as it may seem. But the neoliberals have been very successful in convincing us of that, and convincing us that if taxation does not cover expenditure, we have a problem. We have a problem so serious that governments must enshrine in their constitutions balanced budgets as the standard rule. Of the many failings of the social democratic parties throughout the European Union. For me, perhaps the most shocking was the Prime Minister of Spain, Zapatero, soon after the crisis, pushing for an amendment to the Spanish Constitution requiring balanced budgets. A social democrat pushing for a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. It sounds like some story that a loony Maoist would make up to discredit the social democrats. All right, what is the economics? What is the problem here? Why do I make these statements? If you're interested, this is the book that elaborates what I'm saying now in much more detail. And in it, I attempt to explain economics to people who know no economics. I wish I had a euro for every time I've heard someone say, well, I don't know any economics, so I really can't comment on X, I really can't comment on Y. My profession, the economics profession, has somehow, phenomenally enough, achieved a level of respect and confidence, not only that it does not deserve, but that is in complete contradiction to its behavior and its reality. If you happen to be an economist, and I don't hold that against you, if you happen to be an economist and you want to read the technical aspect of, with all the algebra and other mathematics and jargon, I don't necessarily recommend this book to you, but you will find it in it. You want to see it applied to Europe, then that article in the Journal of Political Economy. Okay. Lionel Robbins, later Lord Robbins, economist at the London School of Economics, in the 1930s, early 1930s, note the date, 1932. In 1932, the unemployment rate in Britain was 10%. And what did Lord Robbins tell us was the economic problem? What is economics? Economics is a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between given ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. So economics is a study of how we allocate our scarce resources. He wrote that when the unemployment rate was 10%. It is difficult to find a better example of total detachment from reality. What is economics? Economics is a study of scarce resources. Unemployment is 10%. Well, it looks like we need to take up some other line of work, doesn't it? If that's because what we have as our definition of economics does not apply. But I shouldn't be too hard on Robbins, because Joe Stiglitz, generally recognized as a progressive economist. Joe is a progressive economist. I've been on panels with him. He is, I would say, even more progressive than Paul Krugman, who is also very progressive. What does Joe Stiglitz and his co-author Walsh, how do they define economics? They would be right at home. They are right at home with Robbins. They say one of the most important points on which economists agree, we all agree, concerns the role of scarcity. We can summarize the point as follows. There is no free lunch. Who made that line famous? Milton Friedman. So here we have one of the most progressive economists in the United States quoting Milton Friedman to tell us what economics is. Having more of one thing requires giving up something else. Tell that to the person that's unemployed. Tell that to the people who are trying to make ends meet. Yes, if you go down and buy another loaf of bread, then you're going to have to give up something else. Scarcity means that trade-offs are a basic fact of life. Trade-offs are a basic fact of life. That is the essence. That is the key to right-wing economics, mainstream economics. That is the statement from which all else follows. And it's wrong. Let's see what Cain said. I won't read it to you. You can read it to yourself. First, he begins with, you might say, a mea culpa. He said, when I wrote the Treatise of Money, generally thought to be by the profession a great work, I had a fundamental mistake. What was my fundamental mistake? Assuming full employment. That is what the quotation means. He said, I did not deal thoroughly with the effects of changes in the level of output. In short, I didn't think about how the economy operated when you didn't have full employment. That was the biggest mistake I made. And that is why he wrote the general theory of employment, money, and interest. Why is it the general theory? Because it is general, because it deals with the operation of the economy at all possible levels of output. While the mainstream still, their economics deals with the special case of full employment. Why does it matter? I mean, is this just sort of some esoteric bicker between Keynesians and non-Keynesians? By the way, I'm always a bit amused when people say Keynesian. I gave a talk once in the question and answer period. When I got through, someone said, oh, well, what you've said, that's just Keynesianism. If I had given a discussion of the physics of the acceleration of falling bodies and said they accumulate speed as they fall through the air, slowed down by resistance from the air, would somebody in the question and answer period had said, oh, that's just Newtonian physics? Keynes was one of many great and minor economists, thinkers, for whom the analysis of the economy was the analysis of what happens when there are unutilized resources. That applies to Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Malthus, everyone really, until the middle of the 19th century. Then in the middle of the 19th century, a man at the University of Manchester named Jevons revolutionized the profession by making it the study of full employment. And what is the difference? It is the difference between astronomy and astrology. There actually are astrologers. Maybe you read it in the newspapers. They're sort of fun, but we don't let the astrologers into the room where they're managing the space probes and other places where we need a bit of science. It's the difference between alchemy and chemistry. And I would say the difference between economics and so-called neoclassical economics. In case you want to know why it's neoclassical economics, it's because that is a name given to economics in the counter-revolutionary revolution against Cain in the early 1940s. But resources are not scarce. Jobs are scarce, especially those that pay above poverty level. Let's just take a look at Ireland. Unemployment has been falling. What the quality of the employment created is another question, but still, there could be no rational person would argue that Ireland is now at full employment. And therefore, almost all the economics you encounter in the newspapers, almost all the economics you hear in the media, see in the media, is wrong. Scarcity is the basis of all mainstream economic theory. No important theoretical conclusion survives in the absence of scarcity. I'm going to give briefly give three examples. One is the idea that free markets offer people choices. Milton Friedman, about 40 years ago, gave a famous talk in London entitled "Free Markets, Free Men." Milton was not terribly strong on gender issues, and also his audience was all businessmen, in which he says the great thing about free markets is they let you choose. You can go into the supermarket, there are all different kinds of things you can choose. You can choose your job, you can choose where to live, not like an essentially planned economy where you are told. This requires full employment. If you have, as you have in Ireland, 7-8% unemployment, what are your job choices? Your job choices are hang on to the job you have or be unemployed, except for a few. Anatole France put it very well. You might say the principle of neoclassical economics is both the rich and the poor have a right to take chances, have a right to be poor, but somehow the Donald Trumps of this world never seem to drop into poverty. Second, I want to talk about austerity. It relates to the title of the conference, A Just Recovery. We might think, what is an unjust recovery? I'll touch on that in just a moment, towards the end. A just recovery is what is happening in Britain. An unjust recovery is what is happening in Britain. An unjust recovery is what's happening in Ireland. In an unjust recovery, the benefits of recovery go to the few and not to the many. The recoveries we've seen are associated with a certain ideology called austerity. And the way this austerity is justified, so like a household, the UK government, the Irish government, the Italian government, any government you want to mention, doesn't matter where you are, must live within its means. You might say that is, I would say live within your means is probably one of the least meaningful statements ever thought up in the English language. And if not, it's borrowing, discourages private investment, alarms capital markets. The message being sent there is that the economy is fully employed and financial markets are competitive. Let me say in that context that even the statement, a government must manage its finances like a household, is nonsense. If by that you think it means balancing the budget. Let me give you a couple of examples. You're lucky enough to be offered a job with higher pay. It's going to start in 3 months. But you have to give your current employer 3 months' notice. So you're going to have 3 months with no income. During those 3 months, are you going to balance your budget? Of course you aren't. You're going to go to the bank, you're going to borrow. Are you going to borrow from friends? You're going to do something. You're going to run a deficit. And the reason you're going to run a deficit is because you know you'll be able to have a surplus later when you get your job. That is what happens when there's unemployment. That's why governments run deficits. Governments run deficits like households between jobs, you might say. You say, okay, well, yes, it's true that households may run deficits, but they should only do it to invest. And the government should have a budget rule. You should only borrow to invest, and you should balance current expenditure. That's just a variation on the austerity theme. It's wrong. There is no theoretical justification for that. Why? Think about it. Why is it a problem if a government spends more than the revenue that comes in? Well, it builds up a debt. But if you can service a debt, businesses do it all the time. Businesses service the debts. So why can't governments do it? Because they will alarm investors. How will that happen? The way they will alarm investors is that the investors will be afraid that when the government goes in and borrows, it will push up interest rates. I assume all of you are aware that the current official interest rate of the European Central Bank is negative. The danger at the moment of government borrowing, pushing up interest rates, is zero. So therefore, why is it a problem? It is an ideological problem. It is a political argument that is being used to push for a smaller state. And I don't know the details in Ireland, but it's clear in Britain. George Osborne, our misbegotten chancellor, in 2010 promised a balanced budget by 2014. It is now 2016, and annual borrowing is about 65 billion pounds. Did George make a mistake? Is he incompetent? Well, he probably is, actually, but not in this regard. As long as there's a deficit, there's an excuse for cutting public expenditure. That is the purpose of the deficit ideology. And the extraordinary thing is that people are convinced of it. When I was out on the doorsteps campaigning for Sadiq Khan, who is now mayor of London, I would say that people would say, well, I am for more expenditure. It's terrible, all these cuts. and we're in favor of restoring many of the public services, but the government has to balance its budget. No, the government does not have to balance its budget. What do we need? As I grind towards the end, an alternative to austerity. This sign was carried at the Occupy movement, which was mentioned. We demand aggregate demand. That is a pure Keynesian, I will admit. The problem here is that there's insufficient demand for goods and services. That's why we have unemployment. That's why we have a deficit. And now I want to finish up by saying a few words about Ireland. 5 years ago, I went to the German embassy in London, and the head of the German Social Democratic Party was speaking. And in this speech, he said, a question was raised about Greece, and this is the head of the Social Democratic Party. He said, well, the Greek government should follow the example of the Irish government, the star pupil of our policies. I felt it would have been difficult to find a more condescending way to refer to any country, but as I said at the time in my question, I said, well, if Ireland is a star pupil, they should see if they can enroll in a different school. Exports, GDP, domestic GDP, and household income compared to 1980. That dashed blue line is Irish exports. They are now 48% higher than they were when the crisis began. GNP is 2% below, though it's recovering. Household income in red is 14% below where it was in 2008. That is an unjust recovery. Adam Smith had a name for that type of economic policy. He called it mercantilism or mercantilism. And it is associated with the growth of GDP and the immiseration of a very large number of people, as your newspapers and the media have pointed out. How do you avoid an unjust recovery? You avoid an unjust recovery through political action, but through reconceiving economics. What is economics? What should it be? Resources in general are not fully employed. What economists should study, and what some of us do, is how to mobilize resources to achieve full employment and maximum feasible output, consistent with environmental sustainability, in order to increase the general welfare. In other words, what we need is an economy fit for human life. Thank you.
Perhaps that might be a good idea. Just say thank you very much for sticking so well to time, because as you know, we are going to have to cut off whenever the President arrives. But we do have, and I will, so excuse me if I do have to stop you in mid-sentence, but it will be for that reason. But while we're waiting for the President, I think it would be very good to take the opportunity to put some questions to Professor Weeks. Is there anybody who would?
Yeah.
If you just wait for the, yeah. And perhaps if it's relevant, you might like to say the institution you belong to or where you're coming from. Thank you.
Yeah, Glenn Fitzpatrick is here with the Financial Services Union. Thanks very much, Professor Weeks, for talking. It's very interesting. Just without wanting to get anywhere near the Brexit debate at all, I suppose one concern I would have about, I suppose, austerity and the notion that there is no alternative is that the impending trade agreement with America, TTIP, could potentially irreversibly lock us into exactly the kind of economics that you're trying to wade us away here from this morning. So if you have any thoughts on TTIP and I suppose what that could bring for us, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Just before you start, Professor, maybe I just see if there's a couple of others,
okay,
and then you could take them together.
Yeah.
Is there a couple of others that people would like to add? Or will we just start with this while the rest of you are warming up? Okay, Professor.
I'll make 2 quick points. One is, TTIP is a case of false advertising. All so-called trade agreements, they aren't trade agreements. The actual tariff levels between the United States and Europe are very, very low. That is not what the agreement's about, as you probably know. It's about investment. It's about giving access of foreign companies to bid on public services throughout Europe. That is the most important aspect, you might say functional aspect of TTIP. That is reinforced by its disputes procedure, which sets up a resolution procedure which is outside the control of governments, outside the control even of the European Union. So these will be courts for which there, in principle, would be no recourse, which are not selected through any system of accountability. So I think it's quite a bad idea. I've written that. But let me, the other quick point. The idea that free trade is a good thing is based upon fatally flawed economic reasoning. I don't have time to go into it now, but if I were to briefly explain the theory that lies behind the idea that free trade is good, if I were to explain that, you would either think that I was creating a straw person, making it up, or you would wonder why all of these trade economists are not in mental institutions.
A man at the back.
Hi, Brendan O'Rourke, Dublin Institute of Technology. I'm what I call a recovering economist, in the sense I'm recovering from some of the ideology, I think, that the neoclassical synthesis created. But one of the things that strikes me is that neoliberalism seems to be a persistent ideology almost, despite, as you pointed out, the discoveries of Cain and others about the futility of austerity. And I wonder, have you any thoughts on how, even when neoclassical economists get it right, as I think they did in Ireland in about 2005, 2006, and actually warned of problems in the economy, unlike their colleagues in the American profession. I'm just wondering, have you any thoughts on how we can make, I suppose, true experts on the economy more responsible or more amenable in the public sphere, in media debates and so on? Because what we tend to get, I fear, is just propaganda from economists, and the media seem to entertain them as experts sometimes. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we might improve the economists or experts on the economy's contribution to public debate. Thanks.
Well, that's a very big question. I would make, I can't come up with the solution, but I'm making a couple of comments. One is the political situation very much determines what many, many economists think. I won't say total opportunist, but there is a bit of that. So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn becoming head of the Labour Party, now we discover that there are a number of economists who, you might say, were sort of soft neoclassicals or soft austerity supporters who have now switched and for their own professional reasons or as a result of soul searching have shifted their position. The same with Bernie Sanders. So you have, though there, Bernie Sanders, who I happen to know, I used to live in Vermont, Sanders has tended to draw his advisors from people who have notorious for having rejected the mainstream. But one thing is, as the political situation shifts, so do the social sciences shift, and that includes the economists. A second, less optimistic note is, I can remember when I took economics, the first meeting of the American Economic Association I ever went to, that a business economist, an economist for a bank, had applied to be on a panel and was not accepted. And these were by right-wing, left-wing, Keynesian, non-Keynesian economists. And they said, he's a very nice fellow, he may have interesting things to say, but he can't say anything that his bank would want him to say. This is an academic conference. It would be appropriate for him to come along if we were having, a debate or something, but not at an academic conference. Most economists now, most mainstream economists now, make a lot of money advising in the private sector. And this, I think, has been very important in shifting the ideology of the profession. As you may know, a notorious case, early part of this century, the so-called Nobel Prize in economics, not really a Nobel Prize, so-called Nobel Prize in economics, was won by two people whose contribution to economics was how to speculate in money markets. In one of those things you couldn't make up, 2 years after they received the Nobel Prize, the company that they had created, the hedge fund they had created, went bust, lost $10 billion. It's one of the rare cases where the punishment fit the crime.
Okay, I can take one or two more, I think. I'm keeping an eye on the corridor. This woman in the front. Excuse me, would you mind speaking into the microphone? Thank you.
Sorry, you said the purpose of taxation was not to fund expenditure. Can you elaborate on the purpose of taxation, please?
Yes, I can. Now, I know you're all thinking, well, he may have been, all right as an economist at one point, but now he's obviously a bit past it, into his 70s, and people's mental facilities start to decline, and you say silly things. All right, so what is the purpose of taxation? Let me take the clearest case, a government which is seeking to manage an economy which has its own currency. The first thing to note about this is that that government can borrow to spend. It can borrow either by selling bonds in financial markets or selling to people like us, or it can sell those bonds to itself. So, for example, the British public debt. Net public debt, when you take out all the assets that the government holds, that is like foreign exchange holdings and so on, is about 85% of GNP. 1/3 of that is owed to the Bank of England. The Bank of England is a public body. The interest paid on that is revenue to the government. That third is not debt in any meaningful sense. You lend money to your husband or your wife. Is that part of the household debt? Well, it would suggest that the household is breaking up if it were. Okay, but then, so I'm warming up to your point. So a government with its own currency can borrow, and it can borrow from itself. So it doesn't even have to worry about the interest rate that it borrows, because it can go to the central bank, whatever the prevailing interest rate is, and sell bonds to the central bank at that interest rate, or lower if it wants to. Okay. So why doesn't it just fund all the expenditure through borrowing and not tax anybody? Expenditure increases aggregate demand in the economy. Government expenditure increases aggregate demand. It hires more people, generates more income. Their income is then spent in the shops. They're spent to do all sorts of things, pay the rent, so on. As you get closer and closer to full utilization of resources, inflationary pressures begin to build up. How do you prevent the inflationary pressures from building up? By reducing the amount that people can spend. How do you do that? By taxing. So what a competent government should do, one which is managing the economy in a competent way, it should be balancing expenditure and taxation in order to achieve certain goals. And those goals would be maximum employment, maximum feasible employment consistent with environmental sustainability and as a long-term goal and a day-to-day goal. A more equitable distribution of income, price stability, and a sustainable external account. And you have a number of instruments to do that. You have the level of taxation, so you use the level of taxation to prevent expenditure from being too great, and that might mean that you tax up to a point where the government has a deficit of, say, 5% of GNP. It might require you to tax up to a point where you have a surplus, 3% of GNP. But you should not be worried about the budget outcome. What you should be worrying about is the level of employment and output you generate. And then you can use the structure of taxation to affect the distribution of income. It is not the most effective way to deal with income inequality, let me say. We don't really have time to go into that because people can avoid taxes, and offshore stuff and all that sort of thing, non-doms. But use the structure of taxation to determine the level of inequality, and use other instruments for the balance of payments and price stability. Now, what about a case of Ireland, which has a currency that it shares with other countries? It is more difficult. You don't have as many instruments, but the same principle allows. If the European Union rules were changed, then there would be nothing no economic argument to prevent the government of Ireland from borrowing from its own central bank. or borrowing from a private bank. But better to borrow from your central bank because that keeps it in-house. So the principle here is that the purpose of taxation is to manage the level of aggregate demand in the economy, not to fund expenditure as such. Though in terms of cash flows, it does flow back into expenditure.
Thank you. This gentleman here. Oh, sorry.
Hello, Tom O'Connor. I'm also from DIT. Just an immediate follow-up to those objectives that you mentioned. The European Central Bank, as I understand, has just a mission statement of price stability, whereas the Federal Reserve in the States, it has two mission statements of price stability, but also full employment. Would you be able to comment on the effectiveness of that latter objective of full employment in the Federal Reserve, or is it just a charade?
That's a very good point, and I would add another characteristic of a Federal Reserve System, which should be put into the rules of the European Central Bank, is the Federal Reserve System is required to have on its decision-making board what are called members of the public. And in more progressive times, for example, when Lyndon Johnson, well, certainly when Roosevelt, but also Lyndon Johnson was president, you would have progressive economists put on it, trade unionists. There would be, the head of the United Auto Workers Union, Walter Reuther, was on one of the boards.
I'm sorry, Professor Weeks.
Okay.
I have to stop you here. I think we're going to have the President joining us very shortly. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Maybe in more later sessions we'll get to proceed with it. And I'm sorry to this woman in the front. I know you wanted to come in, but we'll get a chance later.